Hello, my beautiful buddies. Welcome back. And today we are going to start with Act 2 of the play A Doll's House by Henrik Ibsen. So, this act started on a Christmas day, right? So, Nora continues to be in a deeply disturbed state of mind when the nurse who had been asked to bring the box containing her fancy dress costumes comes with the box. Nora asks her about the children. The nurse replies that they are playing with their Christmas toys but that they have been asking for their mummy. Nora says that from now onwards she would not be able to spend as much time with the children as she had been doing previously. She then asks the nurse how the children would feel if their mummy were to leave them forever. The nurse is astonished by this question. Nora then asks the nurse under what circumstances the nurse had handed over her own children to strangers. The nurse replies that she had given birth to an illegitimate child and that her seducer had done nothing to help her when she was in trouble. The nurse had therefore felt compelled to leave her infant in the hands of others. That was many years ago, and now, says the nurse, her child has grown up into a young girl. Nora then asked the nurse if the latter would look after her children in case she were to go away for good. Then, without waiting for an answer, she turns to the box and opens it in order to take out of the costumes. From this conversation between Nora and the nurse, we also learn that the same nurse had brought up Nora from her childhood onwards because Nora's mother had died when Nora was an infant. That very nurse is now in charge of Nora's three children. When the nurse has gone and Nora is alone, she again begins to feel troubled by all sorts of doubts. Crockstead had threatened her with the disclosure of her criminal act of forgery, and Helmer has made her feel that her influence on her children would be evil. But here you might understand, Helmer does not know in the least that Nora had been guilty of forgery. He does not even know that she had borrowed money from Crockstead. He has been under the impression that she had got the money from the trip to Italy from her father. Nora had never told Helmer about the loan or about the person from whom she has taken the loan or anything about her forging her father's signature. Remember that. Now, indeed, Nora is feeling tortured by her thoughts about Crockstead's threat and even more so about her criminal act and her influence upon her children. Mrs. Linde now pays another visit to Nora. This time she has come in response to Nora's message because Nora needs her help in mending the fancy dress which she proposes to wear at the ball to be held on the following day. Helmer has suggested to her that she should dress herself as a Neapolitan fisher girl and should dance the tarantella which she had learnt in Capri. Mrs. Linde takes the costume and begins to mend it, at the same time thanking her for the nice time she had with Nora and her family last evening when they all celebrated the Christmas Eve at the Helmers' apartment. Dr. Rank had also been present at the last evening festivities. The talk between Nora and Mrs. Linde now turns to Dr. Rank, who had looked very depressed last night when they were all celebrating Christmas Eve. Nora informs Mrs. Linde that Dr. Rank is suffering from a serious disease, tuberculosis, of the spine. He had inherited this disease from his father, who had led a life of dissipation and who had been too fond of wine and women. Mrs. Linde suggests that Nora should give up all her relationship with Dr. Rank. Mrs. Linde has an impression that it was from Dr. Rank that Nora had borrowed the money to take her husband to a warm climate 8 years ago. But Nora tells her that she had not borrowed the money from Dr. Rank for a simple reason that he did not have at that time any money to lend. Now, Dr. Rank had inherited his money much later. However, Nora also says that Dr. Rank would not refuse her money in case she were to ask him for it now. Inwardly, Nora has decided to ask Dr. Rank for money so that she may pay the balance of the loan which she owes to Croxted and thus put an end to the hold which Croxted has upon her. She then sends Mrs. Linde into another room to mend her dress because Helmer has returned home and would not like to see Mrs. Linde mending the dress. Nora now takes up with Helmer the case of Croxted. She had already spoken to him on Croxted's behalf, but he had told her that he could not do anything for that man. Now, once again, she appeals to him to let Croxted keep his job at the bank. Helmer says that he is going to give Krogstad's job to Mrs. Linde. Nora suggests that he should keep Krogstad in his post and dismiss some other clerk in the office in order to accommodate Mrs. Linde. Helmer says that she should not persist in her suggestion because it is simply impossible for him to keep Krogstad in the bank. Nora says that in case Krogstad is dismissed, he might spread false propaganda against him and her and thus bring both of them into disrepute. She recalls the case of a father who had been made the victim of much malicious propaganda and who would really have found himself in trouble if Helmer had not come to his rescue. Helmer says that there is a good deal of difference between his own case and her father's case. Her father's professional conduct had not been entirely above suspicion, while his professional conduct is beyond reproach. He says that he wants to maintain his good reputation and that he is not going to keep Krogstad in the bank no matter what Krogstad does, especially because he has already made it known that he is going to remove Krogstad from the bank. He goes on to say that he does not want people at the bank to think that he can be influenced by his wife and his official decision. Now, understand the societal norms and the issues that are being raised in the play. Now, further, he tells her that there is another reason also why he has decided to dismiss Croxted. He could have perhaps overlooked Croxted's past record, but Croxted has made a nuisance of himself to him at the bank in another way. He and Croxted had been intimate friends at school, and Croxted now embarrasses him by speaking to him always in a familiar manner. Croxted has a tendency to speak to him like an equal, addressing him by his Christian name and trying to show that he is intimate with him. The position is not tolerable to him, says Helmer. Nora says that if Helmer resents Croxted's familiar manner of speaking to him, it only shows that Helmer is a petty minded man. Helmer feels much offended at being called a petty minded man and says that he would put an end to his whole affair by immediately sending the order of dismissal to Croxted. He then summons the maid servant, and asks her to send somebody to Crockstead's house in order to deliver a letter to him. He hands over to the maid servant the order of Crockstead's dismissal in spite of Nora's appeal to him not to do so. He then tells Nora that he fully understands her anxiety and that he knows that her anxiety is due to her love for him, but that he cannot change his decision to dismiss Crockstead. Actually, of course, Helma does not know the true reason of Nora's anxiety in this matter. Nora is worried because Krogstad has given her a threat that he would disclose her criminal act of forgery. But Helmer is under the impression that Nora is feeling worried because Krogstad, after receiving the order of dismissal, would begin to spread false and malicious propaganda against Helmer. Having this impression, Helmer now tells Nora that he has enough strength to face whatever happens and that he is man enough to take everything upon himself. Now, there is an irony in this situation. Helmer means that he has courage enough to face all the consequences of his actions in dismissing Crockstead, but Nora takes him to mean that in case anything happens to her, Helmer would take all the blame upon his own shoulder. He thinks that if Krogstad exposes her act of forgery, Helmer would come forward and declare that he was entirely responsible for whatever Nora had done. Helmer then goes away into this study while Nora feels terribly frightened by the thought that Crockstead would expose her criminal act of forgery. Now Dr. Rank enters. He tells Nora that he's not going to live much longer. He says that his disease has now taken a very serious turn and that very soon his body will begin to disintegrate. He also says that when he is about to die, he will send her visiting card with a black cross on his printed name. Nora has now inwardly decided to obtain some money from Dr. Rank so as to be able to pay Krogstad the balance of the loan which she owes to him and thus put an end to the power which Krogstad has over her. In order to obtain the money from Dr. Rank, she begins to humor him. She goes to the length of showing him her flesh colored stockings. The sight of the stocking tickles Dr. Rank, who asks if she will show him anything more. Actually, his asking her this question implies that he would like to look at her bare legs on which she is to wear the stockings. But Nora says that she would not show him anything more and he should not speak like a naughty man. She is then about to ask him for money, but Dr. Rank at this time declares to her his passion which he has been secretly harboring for her. She has always known that he was in love with her, but she has never given him any sign that she knew the fact. However, when he tells her that he is in love with her, she drops her intention to ask him for money. When he has declared his love for her, it would be dishonorable on her part to ask him for money. To ask for money from him now would mean that she is making some sort of commitment to him. Dr. Rank now goes away into Helmer's study while Crockstead comes to have a private talk with Nora. Crockstead has received the letter of dismissal and now he comes to settle the whole things with Nora and to get her help. He is desperately anxious to keep his job at the bank, so he tells Nora that in case she does not help him to retain his job, the consequences for her and her husband would be very serious. He has brought with him a letter addressed to her husband. He has stated in this letter all the facts about Nora's transaction with him and about Nora's having forged her father's signature. He now tells Nora, after having suffered the loss of his reputation by his criminal act of forgery, He had now decided to lead an upright life in order to re establish his good reputation, but that her husband was now bent upon dismissing him and thus ruining his plan to reform himself. He says that now he does not simply want to retain his job, but that he wants her husband to promote him to a higher post so that in course of time he can become the most important official in the bank. In case she does not manage this, he would hand over the incriminating letter to Helmer, and then both her husband and she would find themselves in trouble. Nora tells him that she is in no position to help him. She admits that she had even thought of committing suicide because of the complication that he has created in her life, but he tells that her suicide is not something easy. Crockstead then goes away, but before going, he drops the letter which he had brought with him into Helmer's locked letter box. Nora feels that very soon Helmer would come to know all the facts about loan and the forgery and that she would be in real trouble. Mrs. Linde, who had been all this time mending Nora's fancy dress in the other room, has now completed the job and she comes to hand over the costume to Nora. By this time, Mrs. Linde has also been able to judge that it was Croxted that Nora had brought the money. Nora now admits to her that she had forged a signature on the bond which she had executed. Mrs. Linde promises to speak to Croxted and prevail upon him to withdraw the incriminating letter. Nora says that something miracle is going to happen. What she meant is that if Helmer comes to know that she had forged a signature, he would take upon himself the entire responsibility. But she is mistaken in this belief. Mrs. Linde goes away to meet Croxted while Nora begins to rehearse the tarantella in the presence of her husband and Dr. Rank. Nora's effort now is to prevent Helmer from opening the letter box as long as possible so that Mrs. Linde get enough time to speak to Croxted and prevail upon him to withdraw the letter before Helmer reads it. She begins to dance the tarantella in a wild and frenzied mood, thereby surprising both Dr. Rank and Helmer. Helmer says that she has forgotten the whole dance which he taught her. Nora says that he must give her the necessary instruction so that she can dance the tarantella properly at the fancy dress ball. After a little while, Mrs. Linde returns and informs Nora in a whisper that Croxted was not available because he had gone out of station and would return on the following day. Now Nora makes up her mind to commit suicide after giving her dance performance at the fancy dress ball on the following day. She inwardly calculates that she has now about 31 hours more to live. She has decided to commit suicide for two reasons. First, because Helmer would now come to know that she had borrowed money and that she had forged a signature. Second, because Helmer, on coming to know about the criminal act of forgery, would take the entire responsibility on his shoulders. Nora doesn't want that Helmer should be put in a position in which he has to perform such a great sacrifice for her sake. Nora does not want her husband to take upon himself the responsibility of what she has done. The best course under the circumstances would be for her to put an end to her life, she thinks. So, this was her decision, the final decision she was taking, that she will commit a suicide. So, that was the end of Act 2. Here, the Act 2 ends. And soon I'll be coming up with Act 3. Till then, keep learning, take care, and bye bye.